If there is one thing that Iran's foreign minister has in common with the American president, it's that they both like to use Twitter. Within an hour of the announcement by Donald Trump that the U.S. would stay in the nuclear deal, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif said Trump's policy towards Iran is desperate. He said recent attempts to dismantle the nuclear deal were part of ongoing violations of the agreement. On Saturday, the foreign minister also addressed Trump's alleged racist comments towards developing countries, saying he was not a reliable person with whom to do business.
As we know, the United States has been very awkward and very difficult as far as lifting the sanctions has been concerned, but we must not forget many other countries that have lifted the sanctions, and life has become much easier in Iran than it was before the deal.
Tough talk from Tehran, inspired in no small part by support for the nuclear deal from Germany, France, Britain, Russia, and China, all the other countries who helped negotiate it.
As we know, United States has been very awkward and very difficult as far as lifting the sanctions have been concerned, but we mustn't forget that many other countries, they have lifted the sanctions, and life has become much easier in Iran than it was before the deal.
Iran's government is motivated to keep the deal alive, but with every repeating deadline, the nuclear debate between the United States and Iran becomes more personal, and not just at the level of government. Zain Basravi, Al Jazeera, Tehran.
Turkey has strongly criticized the U.S. for announcing plans to create a new 30,000-strong border force in northern Syria. It will include fighters from the Kurdish YPG, which Ankara considers to be a terrorist group.
Erdogan vows to drown U.S.-backed Syrian border force before it's born, labels unit terrorist army. The Turkish president has called U.S.-backed Syrian border force using Kurdish fighters a terrorist army, vowing to drown it before it's complete. He also added that military preparations against Kurdish held Afrin already. Our duty is to drown this terrorist force before it is born, the Turkish leader said on Monday, as cited by AP. The 30,000-strong army of traitors that Washington seeks to create will point their guns against U.S. troops at the first threat, Erdogan warned. On Sunday, the U.S.-led coalition announced it is helping to create a new border security force to fight terrorists in Syria. The unit, stationed along the Syrian border with Iraq and Turkey, as well as along the Euphrates River Valley, is expected to be comprised of up to 30,000 people. Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, veterans will make half of the unit, while the other half are yet to be recruited. Washington's role in establishing the force was branded unacceptable by Turkey on Sunday. A key point of discontent here is that Ankara considers the battle-hardened part of the U.S.-backed SDF, Kurdish YPG units, to be linked to the terrorist Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK. Military aid for the Kurds, including arms supplies, has repeatedly caused harsh criticism from Turkey, which is one of Washington's key NATO allies. This is what we have to say to all our allies: don't get between us and terrorist organizations, or we will not be responsible for the unwanted consequences, Erdogan said, as cited by Turkish media. He added that Turkish forces will battle until not a single terrorist remains along our borders, let alone 30,000 of them. Turkish troops are already deployed in Syria, as Ankara provides security across the 4th Syrian de-escalation zone in Idlib province. Despite the fact that military goals in the area have already been achieved, Erdogan vowed to launch an operation against the Kurdish-held Syrian region of Afrin in northwestern Syria. On Monday, the Turkish president reiterated the threat, saying that the operation could be imminent. Meanwhile, Turkish Prime Minister Bekir Bozdağ accused the U.S. of supporting terrorists instead of fighting them, saying it is playing with fire with the decision to create the security force. letting the PID/YPG dash the PKK's branch in Syria by the U.S. to establish a so-called terrorist army for creating a terrorist corridor in the region on the pretext of combating Daesh. Islamic State is not a fight against Daesh and terrorist organizations, rather a support to terrorism and terrorist organizations, Turkish Deputy Prime Minister Bekir Bozdağ tweeted on Monday.
The US is taking worrying steps to legitimize this organization and make it lasting in the region. It is absolutely not possible for this to be accepted. Turkey will continue its fight against any terrorist organization, regardless of its name and shape, within and outside its borders.
Of the 30,000 personnel to be recruited to the force, half will come from the Syrian Democratic Forces, a rebel faction in Syria's civil war. The intention is to place them close to Syria's northern border with Turkey in order to maintain security. The announcement comes after the US revealed it intends to stay in Syria, even though Islamic State has been defeated.
The President has committed, as a matter of strategy, that we will not leave Syria. We're going to stay for several reasons. Stabilization and assistance in the vital north and northeast, protection of our allies, the Syrian Democratic Forces, who have fought so valiantly against ISIS in the northeast, try to work to help transform the political structures in that area to a model for the rest of Syria.
Thomas, as we heard at the end of that report, Russia has now said it's withdrawing its troops from the Afrin area of Aleppo. How significant is that?
It's clearly very significant, because it's doubtful that if Russia hadn't decided to withdraw what it's thought to be was some 200 to 300 troops, servicemen, as the Russian Ministry of Military Affairs refers to them, if they weren't taken out of Afrin, and if Russia hadn't given the go-ahead for Turkey to start this attack on Afrin, it's very, very unlikely that it would have happened at all. Certainly, we've seen Turkish jets bombing Afrin, as I'm sure you saw in that report there, and that's significant as well, because it means that Russia didn't just stand back and say it's removing its troops. It must have said, because it controls the skies over Afrin, it must have said that it would allow Turkish planes to enter the airspace without any sort of impediment from the Russian side. Now, Moscow's been very, very clear about this. It was in a little bit of a tricky position to say really what to do in this situation, whether to side with the Kurds and tell Turkey not to go into Afrin, or whether to side with Turkey, as it has done, and give Ankara the go-ahead. But Russia's been very clear. Moscow, in a recent statement just a couple of hours ago, laid the blame for this attack very clearly at the door of the US, saying that arms that have been provided to Syria's Kurds, and this suggestion of the creation of what was referred to initially as a border force of some 30,000 people in Syria, 15,000 of those on the Turkish border, that would have involved the Kurds. That was clearly too much for Ankara. Ankara clearly put a lot of pressure on Moscow. A number of high-ranking officials visited last week to put pressure on Moscow, and ultimately, clearly, got what they came for.
Turkish planes have bombed what they say are Kurdish rebel positions in both Syria and Iraq. A Turkish official says around 200 PKK fighters were killed in the strikes around Sinjar Mountain in Iraq. And a monitoring group says at least 18 US-backed Syrian Kurdish fighters were killed in the Syrian operation. Hashim Al-Bara is following developments from Gaziantep, close to Turkey's border with Syria.
The airstrikes in Sinjar Mountain targeted PKK positions. The area is about 75 miles from the border with Turkey. The Turkish military says that it has targeted PKK fighters who were channeling weapons into Turkey to be used by their own fighters against government forces. Now, we don't have any statement from the PKK about any figure of casualties, but we do understand that at least 5 Peshmerga fighters were accidentally killed in the attack. The second airstrikes targeted YPG positions in northeastern part of Syria. The YPG is the most active armed branch of the Syrian Kurdish fighters. It's accused by Turkey of colluding with the PKK to destabilize Turkey. The YPG is also an active ally of the United States of America in its fight against ISIL. Now, the Turkish government considers the PKK and the YPG terrorist organizations, and the biggest concern for Ankara is that the two groups pose a real threat to the country. This comes against the backdrop of a military operation which is now underway in the eastern and southeastern part of Turkey, where government forces say they have killed dozens of PKK fighters. On the other hand, we do understand that 4 Turkish soldiers were killed in attacks by PKK fighters.
أولية للقصف التركي على مدينة عفرين. يا رب سلم يا رب، يا رب سلم يا رب، يا رب سلم يا رب، يا رب سلم يا رب.
Shattered glass litters the gutter, while blood stains puddles in the road. In a city all too familiar with such carnage, but nevertheless in shock once again.
At around 7 in the morning, we were standing right here. One suicide bomber was getting off the bus and the explosion happened. We saw flames and people fell to the ground. Some were rescued, but others died. Someone died right here. Before this explosion, another blast occurred near the flag in the square. We were running away from that first explosion when this second explosion took place right here.
The twin blasts went off here in the capital's Tarayan Square during rush hour on Monday. It's a busy commercial hub where labourers gather in the early morning in the hope of finding work for the day. The Interior Ministry says that 2 assailants detonated explosive belts in the crowd. Emergency services rushed to the square as security forces cordoned off the scene. Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi quickly held an emergency meeting with Iraq's Operations Command and intelligence officials, in which he ordered the security of civilians to be shored up. Monday's bloodshed comes just 2 days after another suicide bomber killed at least 4 people at a military checkpoint in the north of the capital.
On Wednesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the U.S. would move its embassy to Jerusalem within the year. He told reporters traveling with him that the move was part of U.S. policy changes that had never happened before. Netanyahu also said that the U.S.'s decision to withhold $65 million in aid to Palestinian organizations were part of policies that are aimed towards strengthening relations between the U.S. and Israel. The U.S. made the decision to move the embassy last month after Trump declared his support for naming Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
In a move that could have deep implications for the peace process. Palestinian leaders have urged the PLO to suspend its recognition of Israel. 25 years on from the Oslo Accords, relations between the two sides are increasingly fragile.
The Palestinian Central Council recommends that the Palestine Liberation Organization's Executive Committee suspends recognition of Israel until it recognizes the State of Palestine, cancels the decision to annex East Jerusalem, and stops settlement activity.
The decision was made at a meeting of the Palestinian Central Council, coordinated as a response to Donald Trump's Jerusalem policy. In December, Trump recognized the disputed city as Israel's capital, backtracking on decades of US diplomacy. And he subsequently threatened to cut US aid if the Palestinians reject peace talks. This Sunday, Mahmoud Abbas called the US president's efforts the slap of the century. He believes that Trump has negated his position as a neutral broker.
Regarding the Oslo Accords, I say that there is no more Oslo. Israel terminated Oslo, therefore one of the decisions that should be taken is regarding the issue of Oslo. Where are we going after Oslo?
Despite the rhetoric, Abbas didn't announce any major policy changes and has said he remains committed to seeking a peace deal without the US as an intermediary. But the Israeli Prime Minister has blasted his speech.
I heard the things that Mahmoud Abbas said. He exposed the truth. He tore off the mask. And he brought to the general public the simple truth that I have been working to make known over many years. That the root of the conflict between us and the Palestinians is their continuous refusal to recognize the Jewish state inside any borders.
It's now up to Abbas to decide if he wants to act on the recommendations, which could spark international backlash. In the past, decisions of the PCC haven't always been implemented.
In an effort to challenge the FCC's recent decision to terminate net neutrality, a group of 21 U.S. state attorney generals filed suit on Tuesday. Additionally, Democrats announced they needed just one more vote in the Senate to repeal the FCC ruling. California, New York, and Virginia were among the states who joined the suit that challenged the action, calling it, quote, arbitrary, capricious, and an abuse of discretion, and saying that it violated federal laws and regulations.
We start this evening with the looming government shutdown. On Thursday, the House passed a continuing resolution kicking the decision over to the Senate. If the Senate fails to come to an agreement in the coming hours, the entire federal government will go on hiatus. For more on this, we go now to RT America's own Ed Schultz. Ed, we hear this every couple of years, the threat of a shutdown. What do you think is different this time around?
Well, I think more people are paying attention to it because of the president. I mean, the news cycle is hot. This is not your ordinary shutdown. There's a lot more issues on the table this time, and the Democrats are playing a pretty tough card right now. The president doesn't want to shut down. He's a deal maker. And so I think that this is going to rile people up. I think there's losers on both sides. A shutdown doesn't do anybody any good, and I think that this is going to play out all the way to midnight tonight. There might be a deal. The wild card is the president.
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer visited the White House today to come to some sort of deal, though it seems like nothing came out of it yet. What did you make of that meeting?
Schumer came away saying that, you know, there was progress and there's negotiations. So I guess that's some kind of hope there. The Democrats are playing a very strange card politically right now. They're going to go home, if the government shuts down, to a commercial, you didn't vote to fund the troops. Who wants that? I think Ted Kennedy would take this deal. I think the Democrats have changed in culture over years. You get 6 years of chips, you take that and run, and you fight for DACA another day. Another thing is the shutdown is going to hurt a lot more people than it's going to help. So why do that? I just think it's a very strange card that the Democrats are playing right now. On the other hand, it really doesn't make the Republicans look very good because they don't have their entire caucus on board. But the People's House has spoken, and the Freedom Caucus chewed it up a little bit. They got in line. They teamed up, and they passed it, and there were 6 Democrats that went along with it. So I think that there's going to be some downside big time.
For Americans sitting at home and watching this, we were talking a little bit before the show, the fact most of them, all of them, send a substantial amount of their paycheck to Washington, D.C. How does this make them feel?
This is going to reverberate all through the country. A lot of Americans send 30, 40, 50% of their paycheck to Washington, and this is what they get? More talk of political posturing and who's going to win and who's going to lose instead of just doing the job for the people. Doing the job for the people, and I come from the school of thought, the government should never shut down. We find money for Iraq to the tune of trillions of dollars, but we can't find money for our troops right now. And what about the world stage? The Democrats have been so concerned about comments made in the Oval Office by the president. What signal does this send to other world leaders that you can't do a deal with the United States, they'll throw their own military under the bus? I mean, it's just bad all over.
And if you were advising Democrats in this moment to try and cut a deal, what would you tell them to do?
Take the deal. Take the deal on chips. That's something that you've always wanted. It affects 9 million. It affects their base, the lower income Americans, okay? You can come back and fight DACA for another day. You're not going to solve immigration issues within the next 6 or 7 hours and get everything you want. The president's going to work on this. And why do it now? Why not do it closer to the election and really point the finger at the Republicans later on? You don't have to fight this fight right now. That would be my advice to the Democrats. And the Republicans, just hold the line, because I think that the Democrats are going to end up paying the big price here politically.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Ed Schultz, host of The News is Ed here on RT America. Thanks so much.
North and South Korea talked music, not missiles today. One North Korean delegate leads a propaganda pop band. All female, all soldiers, hand-picked by Kim Jong-un, they sing his praises. And they may now be heading for South Korea's Olympics. The talks confirmed concerts by a North Korean orchestra. North Korea is preparing a delegation of hundreds for their trip to the global stage. But only 2 of them, a figure skating pair, have actually qualified for the Games.
Kim Jong-un will use the soft power of culture, of music and sport in the Olympics to try to persuade a global audience that his country is perfectly normal and just wants peace. Here in South Korea, they're not convinced.
We've been down this road before. We've seen North Korea in cycles of peace offensive, then provocations, and then dialogue, and the cycle just repeats itself.
Kim Jong-un's media blasted the South for suggesting today's Olympic talks were due to President Trump's pressure on the North. We're here of our own free will, they said, not because of American pressure. That pressure, though, on again, as Vice President Pence heads for a summit in Canada to tighten sanctions on North Korea. Bill Neely, NBC News, Seoul, South Korea.
How to shoot somebody out, Julia. And it's not a cry that you hear at night. It's not somebody who's seeing the light. It's a cold and it's a bright.